Welcome to my podcast, Scientist Free from Religion. This podcast has as proposal, as main idea to talk about a scientific topic but also talk about religion. Different from the common assumption in which science and religion should be separated, here on this podcast we recognize formally that science and religion are not disconnected. Sadly, religion can be a very big threat to science. So on this podcast, the proposal is to talk about it freely, so without fear, without the illusion that they are separate topics. So we are going to cover a possible topic. And most of them will be focused on the connection between religion and science, especially to defend science. That's our goal. Our goal here is to defend science from religion and to help to make science, to spread scientific thinking, especially to defend it against religion.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take the source material you send us, distill it down, and deliver those critical nuggets of insight. Our goal is always to make you the most informed person in the room.
And our mission today is, it's a pretty deep one. We're diving into philosophy, ethical systems, and honestly, a surprising amount of cold, hard statistics.
That's right. The sources you sent in center on a really provocative critique of exclusivist religious claims, authored by Jorge Garapayas, a Ph.D., and it all stems from his post, "Thanks God, Christianity is clearly man-made."
Yeah, that title, it definitely sets a certain tone. It is published on the platform Scientists Free from Religion.
It really doesn't pull any punches.
Mm.
So, okay, let's just get right into it. What is the overarching argument that Pyers is trying to build with this statistical and ethical lens?
Well, the core thesis is really a moral one, but it's grounded in logic. Pyers argues that if Christianity were true, specifically in its literal exclusivist form—
And we should probably define that. The form that requires explicit belief in Jesus for salvation.
Exactly that one. If that version were true, he says the resulting cosmic system would be, and this is his term, a moral nightmare. It wouldn't be a system of divine love or justice. It would be, arbitrary and incredibly cruel.
So he's saying the evidence for its divine origin fails on observable grounds. Like, you can just look at the demographics and the moral outcomes and see it doesn't add up.
Precisely. He contends that the sheer statistical and ethical incoherence of the doctrine points very strongly to a non-divine origin.
That it's a human invention.
Yes. That the system is a human invention reflecting human psychological needs, our fears, and, really critically, human desires for tribal control, not some universal, omnibenevolent truth.
That sets the stage perfectly. And we're not just looking at his main articles, we're also diving into a really engaged follow-up piece where he curated and rebutted several classic apologetic counterarguments from his readers.
Oh, absolutely. That Q&A section is as important as the original critique. So our roadmap for this deep dive is basically in two main phases. First, we have to tackle the statistical foundation, the arithmetic and the ethical problems with the doctrine of eternal damnation. This is where he really establishes the scale of the alleged moral disaster.
And then the second part.
Second, we're going to dedicate a good amount of time to his point-by-point rebuttal of four really pervasive apologetic defenses. They range from, blaming human practitioners to even questioning the credentials of the critic himself.
Okay, let's start with the hard math then. We're calling this section 1, the moral nightmare arithmetic and ethical objections. Pyers kicks things off with what he calls the arithmetic of damnation.
He uses a really effective tactic here. He takes this abstract theological concept of salvation and just forces it into a concrete, modern, statistical reality. But before we get to the figures, we have to be super clear on what he means by the exclusivist view, because that's the specific target of his critique.
Right. Can you spell that out for us? What's the difference between exclusivism and, say, universalism or inclusivism, just so we know exactly whose argument he's addressing?
Sure. So religious exclusivism in the Christian context is the belief that salvation is only possible through accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. It's usually about explicit adherence.
Okay.
Inclusivism, on the other hand, might say that God saves people through Christ's work, but that salvation can extend to people of other religions who are sincere, even if they've never heard the gospel.
And universalism.
Universalism is the belief that ultimately everyone will be saved. Pyers focuses on the exclusivist view because, well, it's been historically dominant and more importantly, it's structurally necessary for the doctrine of hell to work as that eternal stick.
Right, the stakes are highest there. If he can show that the hardline view is morally impossible, the argument really stands. So what are the numbers he's using to build this case?
He pulls global demographic data based on a 2010 Pew Research study, but he updates it to 2023 figures. The foundation is this. Christianity makes up roughly 31.4% of the global population.
31.4%. So that's the potential pool of the saved under that specific model.
The maximum possible pool, yes. And of course, the rest of the world is vast and incredibly complex.
It sure is.
You've got other massive groups. Islam makes up 23.2%. Hinduism is 15%. Buddhism is 7.1%. And critically, Pyers really stresses the rapid growth of atheism and irreligion. It's now the third largest belief group globally at 16.4%.
Wow. So if you add all of those up, plus all the smaller folk religions and everyone who isn't explicitly Christian, the calculation becomes pretty stark, doesn't it?
The mathematical conclusion is just. It's inescapable under the terms he's defined. Approximately 70% of humanity is, by default, condemned.
70%.
Over 2/3 of the world's population right now facing the prospect of eternal torment. Pyers argues that this statistical outcome isn't just unfortunate, it's a profound absurdity if it's based on the idea of a just and loving God.
And it's the sheer scale of this condemnation that really makes the argument so problematic. I mean, we're talking about billions of people.
Billions, and their eternal fate is determined by accidents of history, geography, and birth culture.
Things they had no control over.
Exactly. Pyers spends a lot of time highlighting the magnitude of this injustice. It's not just the billions alive today, it includes countless generations of people born into cultures and traditions where they had zero control. Think about it historically. Before mass communication, if you were born in, say, 12th century China,
your chances of even hearing the specific Christian narrative required for salvation were effectively zero.
Zero. So the system is structured in a way that your geographical access or your historical timing becomes the decisive factor, completely independent of your actual moral character or your intentions as a person.
Which means the divine system is, by design, structured to fail the vast majority of its subjects based on things totally external to their moral choices.
That's his point. If salvation is tied to a geographically localized and historically specific revelation, then the divine system appears to be either grossly inefficient or, and this is worse, fundamentally arbitrary and unfair.
He even gets ahead of the common counter-argument, right? The one that tries to soften the stance. The more modernized version, where the definition of who's condemned gets a bit narrower.
Right. He anticipates that. Even if apologists try to, drastically reduce the condemnation rate by saying God saves people who sincerely seek truth, or maybe only condemns those who maliciously deny Jesus, after hearing the gospel, Pyers says the numbers are still ethically unviable.
So even if you argue it's only 10% of the world,
even then, you still end up with, in his words, hundreds of millions of eternal victims.
Hundreds of millions of people facing infinite suffering for a finite and often unintentional mistake. The system, by his measure, is still morally incoherent because the punishment is so wildly disproportionate to the crime, no matter how small you make the group.
It proves the problem is structural. The arithmetic shows that the fundamental moral premise, that non-belief necessitates eternal damnation, is just incompatible with any definition of justice that we as humans would recognize as fair or benevolent.
And this numerical absurdity flows directly into the next part of his argument, the ethical and structural flaws. It's this arbitrary nature of the judgment that he seems to find so disturbing.
It really is. It raises these profound ethical questions about divine justice that, they mirror the ones we ask of our own human systems. The core question Pyers asks is very direct. Is it just to punish someone for the sin of being born into the wrong culture?
And he uses real-world examples.
Tangible examples. If you're born in Saudi Arabia today, the chances are incredibly high you'll be a Muslim. If you're born in rural India, you'll likely be Hindu. These are demographic realities shaped by thousands of years of history, not conscious, malicious choices to deny a known truth.
So a deity who is omniscient, who knows the outcome of every birth before it even happens, and still creates a system like this. Well, it can't logically be called benevolent, can it?
The contradiction is central to his whole argument. The idea of an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being is just logically shattered by a system that results in the guaranteed eternal failure of the majority of its own creations.
I see. So if God knows that being born in a certain place effectively precludes belief, The outcome is predetermined.
Exactly. It makes the whole thing look less like justice and more like a celestial lottery where the odds are just massively rigged against most of the players from the start.
And Pyers goes further. He argues this isn't just arbitrary, it's a tool. He claims the doctrine of hell doesn't really function as moral justice, but as a mechanism for social control.
He's very forceful on this point. He calls it the eternal stick, used to ensure compliance and obedience. The threat of infinite suffering simplifies a very complex moral reality into a simple binary choice. Obey our tribal rules or face an eternal catastrophe.
So he's suggesting it's more indicative of a human psychological need, a way for a group to manage its members, than a divine moral code.
That's the idea. It's control dressed up as cosmic law. And this brings us to a really crucial analogy he uses, contrasting this divine system with our own human justice systems. He calls it the problem of the second trial.
Okay, what's the analogy?
It's powerful because it makes the moral case so tangible. Even our deeply imperfect, fallible human justice systems, they allow for things like appeals, revisions, rehabilitation. We allow for new evidence to be introduced.
And we recognize that finite crimes deserve finite punishments.
Right. Our systems, at their best, prioritize reform and eventual reintegration.
But the religious model, as Pyers critiques it, has none of that flexibility.
None. He stresses that in the exclusivist model, one lifetime, no matter how short or constrained or deprived of information it was, determines an infinite fate. There is, and he's emphatic, no second chance.
So if new evidence comes to light, or if the person morally evolves after judgment, it just doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. The decision is final, infinite, and irreversible.
That's really the core of the ethical charge, isn't it? I mean, if a human court sentenced someone to infinite torture based on one single mistake, we would universally condemn that system as barbaric and immoral.
And Pyers is challenging the listener to apply that exact same moral standard to the divine system. If we find human systems of infinite torture morally indefensible, why do we accept a cosmic one? He suggests that for a divine system to be truly just, it would have to include mechanisms for redemption or appeal.
Or at least a finite punishment for a finite life's failures.
Of course. A loving, omniscient creator should, logically, prioritize the moral evolution of a soul, not its eternal, static torture, for a single error made under constrained circumstances.
So he's saying that the ideal divine system should look more like a perfect, infinitely patient, restorative justice system, which the doctrine of hell fundamentally fails to be.
Correct. The appeal mechanism is so critical because it acknowledges the inherent complexity and changeability of human beings. To lock a soul into an infinite penalty based on a single, finite performance, especially when that performance is so heavily determined by arbitrary birth factors, that is the very definition of injustice.
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my books about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how I can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon. So you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon. Hopefully, in the future, I'm going to write also about religion, atheism, and science. But I do have a podcast. I do have a blog called the Scientists Free from Religion. The same name of the podcast. And you can find several already publications about several topics in which we talk about science, religion, and atheism. So, hope you enjoyed the show. So, let's come back to the show.
This moral critique leads us right into his philosophical conclusion about the true origin of the doctrine. He addresses the apologetic attempts to soften it, what he calls the emotional band-aids.
Yes, he observes that modern theologians often try to soften the blow. They'll suggest things like, well, maybe good atheists can be saved, or that hell is just separation from God, not literal fire.
Or that people are only punished if they deny Jesus maliciously.
Right, and he dismisses all of these as emotional band-aids on a logically amputated doctrine. That is a very sharp phrase.
It is. What's the insight there?
His point is that the very need for this continuous softening exposes the doctrine's moral fragility. If the literal claim hellfire for non-believers were truly part of an omnibenevolent plan, theologians wouldn't feel this constant moral pressure to dilute it.
So the fact that the doctrine needs constant updating to remain palatable to modern humane sensibilities is, for Pyers, evidence that the original claim is morally indefensible.
And therefore likely not divine. It shows that our human moral progress is actually outstripping these ancient religious texts.
To reinforce this moral judgment, he brings in the philosopher Bertrand Russell.
He does. He uses Russell to ground the secular ethical critique. Russell, who was a staunch atheist and, for many, a moral compass in the 20th century, stated it very bluntly. He said, "I do not myself feel that any person who is really profoundly humane can believe in everlasting punishment."
So for Russell, it wasn't just intellectually questionable. It was a sign of a moral failure in the believer.
Exactly. It suggested a lack of profound humanity. Pyers completely agrees, and he links the doctrine of hell to what he claims is its origin: human cruelty projected onto the cosmos. He says it's fundamentally revenge psychology.
What does he mean by revenge psychology in this context?
He argues it's that primitive impulse to demand absolute, satisfying retribution for an offense. Mature, evidence-based justice systems, like modern secular law, they strive for correction, proportionality, rehabilitation.
But revenge psychology just wants to see suffering.
It seeks satisfaction through the infliction of suffering, regardless of any corrective effect. By defining deviation from doctrine as an offense worthy of infinite torture, Pyers argues that the doctrine of hell elevates that primitive, tribal impulse to a cosmic law. It promises justice only by denying mercy and demands obedience through pure terror.
So, to sum up this whole first section, the argument rests on the idea that these flaws are so systemic, statistically absurd, ethically unjust, psychologically revealing that they just have to imply a flawed human origin.
That's the summation. The doctrine is structurally flawed, morally grotesque, and it fails the test of modern, rigorous, secular ethics. And that is why he concludes, thanks God, Christianity is clearly man-made. It's a structure perfectly tailored to human needs for certainty and control, but, he argues, impossible to attribute to a truly just, universal creator.
That is an incredibly comprehensive critique. But of course, he didn't write this in a vacuum. He got significant pushback, which we need to get into now. This is where he turns his readers' defenses into more evidence for his claim. Let's move into section 2, critiquing the Foundation's responses to apologetics.
This section is absolutely pivotal. It shows the resilience and the intellectual rigor of his method. He got dozens of responses, many repeating standard defenses, and he curated the four most representative ones to systematically dismantle them.
And we start with question 1 from a commenter named MTL. This is the classic maneuver, isn't it? Blaming the practitioners, not the practice. MTL suggested Pyers was just explaining the horrific abuse in the name of religion, but failing to critique the pure underlying faith itself.
Yes, this is the flawed human defense. The argument is, God is good, humans are flawed, therefore things like the Inquisition or the witch hunts were the fault of flawed humans misapplying the system, not a fault of the system itself.
And Pyers' response?
He emphasizes what he calls structural accountability. He argues that this distinction just collapses under scrutiny because religion isn't some abstract idea floating above reality. It is entirely implemented by people.
But wait, a defender could argue that any system can be corrupted by flawed humans, right? Secular governments, economic ideologies. How does Pyers differentiate the corruption of religion from, say, the corruption of a democracy?
That's a critical question, and he addresses it by focusing on the inherent structure of the system. He makes an accountability point. If religious traditions want to claim credit for the good things, for charity, for inspiring great art, then they must logically bear responsibility for the harm done for the exact same reasons.
You can't just selectively credit the system's successes while outsourcing its failures to human nature.
You can't, and the core danger, he says, is structural, not incidental. Pyers outlines what he sees as the perfect predictable conditions for abuse. A belief system that claims divine authority, which makes its rules non-negotiable. Then it labels dissent as sin or heresy, which moralizes the opposition. And finally, it demands absolute obedience, which centralizes power without any real checks or balances.
So this structure doesn't just occasionally get corrupted. It creates, in his words, ideal and predictable conditions for abuse at scale.
Precisely. The lack of an internal secular mechanism for appeal or revision or democratic oversight means that corruption is a feature, not a bug. In a secular system, checks and balances are designed specifically to mitigate the inevitable flaw of human agency.
Whereas a system claiming divine mandate actively disables those secular checks.
It disables them. It substitutes them with faith and authority. The ultimate danger for Pyers is that by blaming flawed humans, the worldview shields itself from any real intellectual or moral accountability. It becomes beyond critique because any negative outcome can always be dismissed as a deviation from the pure ideal.
That intellectual surrender takes us directly to question 2, a really common maneuver in these debates, the credential challenge. A commenter named Arthur Wary questioned Pyers, despite his Ph.D., basically saying his disagreement must come from ignorance.
Yes, claiming Pyers wrote a distorted version of Christianity that ignores centuries of biblical teaching. Pyers identifies this immediately as a classic rhetorical tactic, what he calls selective credentialism.
The implication being, if you disagree, you just must not have studied it correctly or deeply enough.
It's a mechanism used to protect belief when the doctrine is challenged by a rigorous, informed, secular critique.
But that claim, that informed disagreement equals ignorance. It collapses pretty quickly, doesn't it? He backs this up with specific examples of academics who specialized in these fields and still reached non-theistic conclusions.
Oh, absolutely. These are not casual critics. They are specialists who spent their entire lives immersed in the very texts the commenter claims Pyers ignores.
Who does he name?
He names highly influential scholars. For instance, Bart Ehrman, who is one of the world's leading New Testament textual critics. His life's work is on the historical Jesus and the transmission of the Gospels. His conclusions about the historical unreliability of the scripture come from deep textual analysis, not from some external skepticism.
And Richard Carrier, the ancient historian?
Yes, who focuses on the origins of Christianity. And he also cites Elaine Pagels, a renowned scholar of early Christianity and Gnosticism, and Hector Avalos in biblical studies. These individuals prove that the most powerful critiques often come from those who know the material best.
He also broadens the lens beyond just religious studies, right? Citing people like Bertrand Russell.
And giants of 20th century science, Albert Einstein, Steven Weinberg, Francis Crick, Jacques Mahmoud. The essential point is this. The claim that disbelief reflects ignorance is demonstrably false.
And it's also a failure to engage with the substance of the argument.
Exactly. Instead of pointing out which specific claim Pyers distorted, where's the statistical error, where's the ethical miscalculation, the commenter just vaguely invokes centuries of biblical teaching. It's an appeal to tradition and authority that completely avoids evidence.
Pyers' point seems to be that if the system were internally consistent and historically accurate, it wouldn't need to dismiss critical scholars as simply being uninformed.
The rebuttal concludes that serious engagement means addressing the evidence, the 70% condemnation, the proportionality of hell with counter-evidence, not by questioning the intellectual standing of the critic.
Okay, that leads us to Q3, the illusion of benign rebranding. A commenter, William Schneeberger, suggested Pyers' argument was too narrow, that milder, more liberal types of Christianity exist that address these criticisms, citing groups like the Church of the New Jerusalem.
This is the attempt to shift the goalposts to the more palatable fringe versions. Pyers' response is pretty comprehensive. He states he has no hope for Christianity, not because it fails to rebrand, but because every single rebranding ultimately reproduces the same underlying structural problems.
What he calls structural reproduction. So you can change the name, soften the language, get rid of the fire and brimstone, but the core issues persist.
The structure remains. You have the same core text, the same central figure, the same appeal to a revelation that's supposedly immune to external critique, and crucially, the same surrender of critical authority to that divine source.
And the most compelling part of this rebuttal is when he brings in Christopher Hitchens's perspective to explain why a peaceful church isn't intrinsically peaceful.
Yes, Hitchens provided the perfect analogy. Piers cites him discussing benign sects like the Quakers. Hitchens acknowledged they seem gentle today, but argued that their gentleness is not intrinsic to their religious doctrine.
It's enforced externally.
It is enforced externally because secular civil society has defanged them.
Wow. So their moral evolution isn't a consequence of their faith, but a consequence of external pressure laws, human rights movements, the power of secular reason.
That's the power of the analogy. Peaceful religion, as Piers and Hitchens see it, is like a, quote, domesticated predator kept in a cage of secular law. It stays quiet and gentle, not because its nature changed, but because it lost the social and political power to impose its historically strict and potentially violent interpretations.
Piers also leverages Hitchens' specific moral critique against the core Christian doctrine of vicarious redemption. For listeners who might not have heard it put so sharply, why did Hitchens find that idea so morally grotesque?
This is fundamental. Vicarious redemption is the idea that human sin or moral debt can be transferred, that one person's sacrifice, Jesus Christ, can absolve another person's moral debt. Hitchens argued this was morally grotesque because it completely undermines personal moral agency and responsibility.
It outsources responsibility.
Exactly. From a secular ethical view, morality requires effort, choice, and consequence. If your guilt can just be transferred through faith, it negates the need for genuine self-correction or moral struggle. If you can be saved by belief, regardless of your personal moral balance sheet, the system isn't based on justice. It's based on ritual compliance.
Which brings it all back to his point from Section 1. The system undermines the integrity of human moral action.
You can rebrand the threat of hell, but if the core mechanism involves believing one person's sacrifice forgives another's moral debt, the system remains, for Piers and Hitchens, structurally anti-ethical.
Which brings us to the final curated critique, Q4. A commenter, Garrett B. Maddie, tried to defend Christianity by appealing to its diversity, saying things like, literal form isn't the right phrase, Christianity isn't a single text or fixed narrative.
This is using complexity as a shield. If it's so complicated, doesn't that make it harder for Piers to pinpoint a single flaw?
And Piers argues the exact opposite.
The exact opposite. He says appealing to plurality doesn't solve the problem, it exposes it. While Christianity is diverse, it fundamentally does claim access to a divinely revealed truth. And if this revelation were perfect and clear, diversity should eventually resolve into consensus.
But instead, you see perpetual schism.
Exactly. Piers argues that this radical doctrinal divergence, and he cites the World Christian Encyclopedia, there are over 45,000 Christian denominations worldwide.
Wait, 45,000? How is that even possible if it's all from one divine source?
And that number for him is an epistemic failure. What is the point of a revelation if it requires 45,000 differing interpretations to define it?
He draws a critical comparison there between convergence and schism.
Yes. If the revelation were clear and consistent, like an objective fact of nature, you would expect human attempts to understand it to eventually converge on a central shared understanding. Instead, the system behaves exactly like other non-evidence-based systems, like political ideologies or folklore, where interpretive freedom just explodes into fragmentation.
And he brings in the historical context to back this up. Unity wasn't organic, it had to be imposed.
Right. He reminds us that the early church was radically pluralistic. You had Gnostics, Marcionites, Arians, all claiming legitimacy. Unity was achieved not by finding a clearer truth, but by political entrenchment, specifically following figures like Emperor Constantine. Orthodoxy, the correct belief, was defined retrospectively by imperial councils and enforced through political power.
So stability was achieved through coercion, not clarity. The very unity that defenders might point to as evidence of truth is actually evidence of power dynamics.
Precisely. And the fact that as soon as that political enforcement weakened, schism exploded into 45,000 denominations, well, that demonstrates the structural frailty of the original revelation.
And the question he leaves the reader with is just profound. Why does a supposedly perfect revelation generate less agreement than fallible human sciences?
That comparison reframes the whole discussion. It moves it away from theology and into epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. Fallible human science, through peer review and evidence, converges on consensus about gravity or evolution. But a supposedly perfect divine revelation generates endless, irreconcilable divisions. For Piers, that is damning evidence.
These 4 rebuttals really show how rigorous his method is. He uses secular evidence, statistical reality, and structural analysis to turn the defenses of faith into more evidence for its human origin.
And that rigor is maintained all the way through, even in the rules he sets for his forum, which brings us to our final synthesis.
Before we wrap up, we should touch on his strict comment policy. He required all arguments to be made in secular terms and banned scriptural citation as a form of authority.
This is such a crucial element of his methodology. It's not just about moderation, it's a foundational demand for public reasoning. By insisting that claims must stand or fall based on logic, shared evidence, and universal moral principles, not appeals to an internal, non-testable source like Scripture, he forces the discussion onto common ground.
He's basically saying, if a belief system wants to influence public discourse or law, it has to play by the same rules as science, philosophy, and law. Quoting Scripture carries no argumentative weight here because it's an assertion of authority, not a demonstration of evidence.
And this commitment to secular reason ties directly back to his psychological diagnosis of faith. He reiterates his view that religion reflects the psychology of its human creators. It offers comfort, certainty, and control.
It simplifies the incomprehensible complexity of human existence into that dualism. Obedience versus rebellion, heaven versus hell, a moral algorithm designed not for truth, as he puts it, but for tribal cohesion.
And that simplification, while it might be psychologically comforting, is what allows these huge ethical inconsistencies, like the arbitrary damnation of the 70%, to be overlooked in favor of the emotional benefits of belonging.
In his final contrast, we see the ultimate separation he's making between revelation and human achievement. He sets the human invention of hell against the human invention of reason. This is what he calls the real miracle.
The irony he points out is so stark. The same species that conceived of this doctrine of infinite arbitrary punishment also conceived of reason, refined systems of empathy, and invented the methodology of science.
So it's not just a negative rejection of one system. It's a positive affirmation of our human capacity for self-correction. We are capable of both primitive cruelty and complex structural compassion.
Piers argues that only one of those systems, reason and ethical reflection, comes from observable evidence and critical testing. The more we rely on that innate human capacity, he says, the less we need to project tyrants into the sky to enforce a morality we are capable of discovering ourselves.
So our salvation, as Piers concludes, isn't in divine mercy or revealed authority, but in the human capacity to question it. It transfers the full weight of moral responsibility squarely back onto our own shoulders.
And that is an empowering, if definitely challenging, conclusion. The idea that our most reliable guide to a moral world isn't an ancient external text, but our shared human capacity for rigorous, evidence-based reason and empathy.
This has been a truly rigorous deep dive into Jorge Piers' critique. We've extracted some incredibly sharp insights by looking at his use of statistics, ethics, and his point-by-point rebuttals.
Yeah, we covered 3 core takeaways. First, that statistical dilemma of condemnation. If salvation is exclusivist, then at least 70% of humanity is condemned by geographic accident, which makes the system morally incoherent at scale.
Second, the structural critique of divine authority. The argument that a system claiming absolute authority creates ideal conditions for abuse, and so it can't be absolved by just blaming flawed humans. Corruption, in that context, is a structural feature.
And finally, exposing plurality as an epistemic failure. The staggering diversity, those 45,000 denominations, demonstrates that doctrinal unity was achieved historically through power, not through the clarity of the revealed truth.
It really challenges you to look at these doctrines not through the lens of inherited tradition, but through the hard, cold lens of logic and statistical reality.
Right.
That's the power of his method.
Absolutely. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider, one that builds directly on the source material. If the human capacity for reason, self-correction, and empathy is indeed the most reliable moral compass we possess, if that is the real miracle of our species, what specific ethical responsibilities does that place on us for structuring our societies, our laws, and our global educational systems, absent any claim to a divine mandate?
If we can't outsource moral authority to the cosmos, where does that universal moral authority reside, and how do we build it? That's a question worth mulling over long after this deep dive concludes. Thank you for joining us.
Until next time, keep questioning.
We'll see you soon.
Hey there, you arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel and also keep watching because there are 7 episodes. So you just if you enjoyed this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence. And also I have a blog called Scientists Free from Religion on Medium. And there are several blog posts there. And you can enjoy it, you can read it. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share it with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.